This is the Spirit and Wellness Show. News and information from a higher perspective. With your host, Harry Wilkinson.
Yes, hello, and welcome to the Spirit and Wellness Show. I am your host, Harry Wilkinson, and this is the show where we take a look at the days and weeks, events, happenings in the world of politics, in the world of entertainment, health, science, and we take a look at it from a higher perspective. We take a look at it from a metaphysical point of view, a spiritual point of view, and by spiritual, of course, and this always comes in at the beginning of the show because I always feel the need to preface it to point out that when I say spiritual, I'm not talking about religious. I'm talking about a sense of connection, of oneness with everything that is. So in some people's belief systems, that sounds more like metaphysics or philosophy, so it just depends on how you view these sorts of things. But the concept here is that I'm not coming from a particularly religious perspective, or at least an organized religious perspective, but from a sense of, a rather more mysterious sense of transcendence, if you will. But someone else pointed out something to me when I mentioned coming from a spiritual perspective that seemed to upset them. And I've gotten this more than one time. Because I mentioned a spiritual perspective, and then they start talking about that's dangerous because you can let in evil spirits, and it goes against God because you're interacting with spirits. And I came to realize a fundamental misunderstanding that was going on communication-wise. When I said spirituality, what that brought to mind was what they really thought I was talking about was spiritualism. Now, spiritualism is a belief in spirits, and one of the major religions that's steeped in spiritualism is, of course, the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church believes in spirits, in ghosts, in also in saints and such, but also in evil spirits that can possess the human body, that sort of thing. So there are religions that have a spiritualism involved in them. There was a spiritualist, and I think still is, a spiritualist movement that had to do with, it was at its probably at its most popular in the 19th century. Pardon me. In the 19th century, when people like Madame Blavatsky, for instance, would hold seances to talk to those who had passed over. And you probably have seen variations of the scene, people sitting around a table and there being knocks on the table and communications sounds coming from the walls and all of that sort of thing. So that is spiritualism. It is not spirituality. Spirituality is a much broader idea. It's the sense that we are something more than just our physical bodies, that something more is going on besides the physical space that we see. So that was a confusion that I did not expect, but come to realize that some people do have that misunderstanding in that the difference between spiritualism, belief in spirits, and spirituality. I guess you could sum it up and say that while spiritualism is a belief in spirit, spirituality is a belief or understanding that we are spirit. That might work. I don't know. In any case, the point of this show is to look at things from a spiritual perspective, to take a step back, connect to the truth of who and what we are, and see how that's being reflected, or how that is being played out in the situations we create in the real world. Because all of these, the stories that we hear on the news, everything that happens around us, we are creating, and we're creating for a reason. And we create these things so that we can go into them, we can experience that which we are not, which leads us back to the truth of who and what we really are. The long and short of it there. And so that's what I try to do, take a look at these instances and lend some insight and also give some helpful hints. That's the wellness portion of our program too, which we will, I promise, get to this week. We've been talking about yoga poses, so I have a yoga bridge pose to tell you about. Very powerful pose that helps alleviate stress and mild depression, calms the mind, and so forth. And we're going to talk about some of the major things that have happened this week in the news. We're going to talk also about how astrology plays into this sort of thing. Now, you may, as I say, you may or may not, believe in astrology or believe that it works or what have you. I use it as a reference point. I feel like it is a good guide to what what is going on a planetary level too. So I have been talking since 2012 about the Uranus-Pluto angle, the square that those two planets have been involved in, and what that means for the world, a time of revolution and change and upheaval. So I'm going to talk more about that, and there's a nice article that actually looks back at the history of Uranus and Pluto and their angles, and how historically that has tended to play out. So we're going to look at that. But first I want to talk about what I call spiritual turning points. For the past couple of weeks, I've been talking about the fact that these problems that we have, whether they be, the economy, whether they be political, whether they be social, poverty, income inequality, all of these issues that seem to go on and get debated endlessly. And we try to give them solutions. We try to solve them at the political level. And we find that we don't get very far. We try to maybe solve them at the community or the community level, where we give donations or we campaign for change, or try to influence policy that way, and we find that we don't get very far. We sometimes throw money at a problem and see if it will change things, and it doesn't. And what I've been talking about is the fact that there aren't any solutions to problems politically. There are no military solutions to problems. We know that. We've seen that play out probably most strikingly in the Middle East. But we know there are no military solutions to problems. And we know that there are even no financial solutions to problems. All of these things are tools that can be used to help solve a problem, but they are not in and of themselves going to solve problems. There is only one thing that solves problems. There's only one solution, and that is a spiritual solution. And what I mean by a spiritual solution is an awareness, a raising of awareness, a change in spirit, if you will. And I've talked about this in relation to the fact that in relation to the fact that we can't seem to get certain things done. For instance, in protecting our children from guns. President Obama talked about that, and how the change has to come from people, from within. There has to be a change in awareness and spirit before anything else can happen. Everything else follows that. And what we've seen recently, I referred to the gay marriage situation, where all of a sudden, after years and years and decades of fighting for, people fighting for the right to, for gays and lesbians to have their marriages, accepted, all of a sudden, it's happening quickly. I mean, state after state is, accepting of gay marriage. And now, this week, of course, the big news is that the Supreme Court has said that gay marriage is something that states cannot ban. And all of this change has happened within a period of 2 years, after decades, as I said, of struggling. All kinds of political activism, all kinds of, protests. And all it took was this change in spirit. So where does that change in spirit come from? How does it happen? It comes from awareness. I think awareness dawned on people over a period of time. But once you reach a level of awareness, then it all happens. And it happens quickly. And all the tools that you need, whether they're political, monetary, military, anything else that you need, just flows, because the spirit is behind it. So we've seen that turning point, and another turning point, actually, very similar kind of situation, has to do with the Confederate flag. There are states in this country that have been flying this flag in state and federal buildings and on license plates, and honoring this flag as if it were the same as the American flag. And it's interesting, for decades, right, and basically just after the Civil Rights Movement, when that began to emerge, many states in the South resurrected the Confederate flag. It was a flag that had pretty much, been marginalized since after Reconstruction in this country, the late 19th century. And then all of a sudden, when the Civil Rights Movement began and the Civil Rights Act was passed, this Confederate flag reemerged as something that Southern states wanted to brandish. And for decades, we've been dealing with that. And for African Americans and others who find this offensive, we were told we had no right to feel that way, that it was a part of Southern heritage, and that it did not represent racism in any way. And I think you just get used to certain things, as much as they may bother you. You see the Confederate flag, and somebody's got it on their windshield, the back of their pickup truck, or whatever. Or worse, you see it flying over a state capitol building, as they were doing in South Carolina. And it bothers you, but you say, well, that's just the South. That's what these people do, and you kind of brush it off that way. And that's how you sort of get into sort of a dull acceptance of things that really need to be changed. Because you just feel like, well, you can't change it, or that's just the way it's going to be. And everything that has changed, people have gone for years feeling that way before, civil rights were enacted. Black folks just said to themselves, well, this is just how it's going to be. White people just said, well, this is just how it is. And then all of a sudden it wasn't anymore. And very quickly, too. Because that change happened, that spiritual turning point happened, and people became aware. So that's happening with the Confederate flag now. After what happened last week, which we talked about, this young man, Dylan Roof, in South Carolina, who went into a historically black church, and after participating in Bible study for about an hour, took a gun and killed 9 people. And that seems to have been the catalyst for a demand that this Confederate flag not be prominently displayed in a state or federal building. Because to give aid and comfort to people like Dylan Roof, who was an avowed racist, had connections with all kinds of hate groups, to allow that flag to be displayed prominently is a tacit kind of agreement or support of that kind of point of view. And I think people are starting to get that now, because state after state, they are now either posing laws or making statements where they will not allow this Confederate flag to be part of government buildings, government institutions, or on license plates. For instance, here in Virginia, our governor has said that that will no longer be an option for people getting license plates in Virginia. So, and this is one of the states, certain parts of the state where you see a lot of that kind of thing, a lot of these Confederate flags, and it's happening so quickly now, after decades of having put up with this, having complained about it, and having been, having had it, explained away or defended. Now, politically, even Republicans are on board with, getting rid of this Confederate flag. I mean, if it's a symbol of Southern heritage, it's a heritage that, if you're proud of that heritage, if you're proud of a heritage of racism and slavery, in which human beings were kept as animals, if you're proud of that, that's something that speaks volumes about you. So if you try to tell me that the Confederate flag represents Southern heritage that you're proud of, you're basically saying it represents your pride in the racism of your ancestors. So, yes, it's a symbol of racism then. That argument just turns in on itself after a while. So, it's wonderful that there's been this spiritual turning point. And President Obama also spoke about the fact that, with the gun debate, and we haven't reached that point yet, but that we will. And this gives me much more hope that this will happen one day. We don't know what it will take. One would have thought that the school shootings in Connecticut, in which 5-year-old children were murdered, one would have thought that would have been enough to make the change. But fear takes a long time to dissipate, and that's what I think is behind all of that. I think that's what holds back any spiritual turning point is fear. And so one has to just go through that process. All right, so I've spoken on that, probably a little too long. But, as I mentioned astrologically, we've been talking about the Uranus-Pluto contrast. Uranus is the planet of revolution, of change, of intuition, to a certain degree, whereas Pluto is the planet of control and, in some cases, obsession and destruction. It's associated with death and rebirth. So, with those two planets at odds with each other, it sets up a time of spiritual or political or social upheaval, where things are changing, but it's a kind of change where, it's one step forward, 2 steps back, but people become more aware of things that need to be changed. It just doesn't happen easily. So rather than there being a revolution, it's an upheaval that has to be followed by changes. So we've just come out of this period from 2012 to 2015. It ended in March, where Pluto and Uranus were at odds with each other and would come into direct contact with each other at certain periods of time. And during this period, as I mentioned, and as I said, you would see quite a bit of social upheaval. And we've seen it in Ukraine and Russia's relationship. We've seen it in Egypt and the Middle East, and the Arab Spring was all part of it. And it's brought a greater awareness of the things that need to be changed, and steps towards changing it. In this country, it's brought a lot of awareness on things like the income inequality debate, and also greater awareness, particularly recently, on racial disharmony, and in particular the force that is used by those who, police officers and others who carry authority, the undue force that is often perpetrated on African Americans. And this is very Uranus-Pluto. Pluto being the power planet, the planet that represents that sort of authority, and Uranus being the planet of social change and revolution. And with those two against each other, with Pluto trying to dominate Uranus and Uranus fighting back, you see the upheaval that has happened in several circumstances where police brutality, police murder of African Americans has become a major concern. So this article gives a really good look at the connections between Uranus and Pluto, those two planets, and historically the changes that have come because of them. And the article mentions that when Uranus makes angles in the sky to slow-moving Pluto, the effects are seen for years and revolutions literally occur. Because they're slow-moving planets, it takes a while for these things to happen. So this article actually pinpoints 7 revolutionary eras, and you can see that Uranus and Pluto were a part of them. Now, when Uranus and Pluto aren't at angles against each other, but are favorably connected in what they call a conjunction, then revolution moves very quickly. There's power behind the desire for change. So Pluto aligns with the change rather than fighting the change. So there are 7 eras that we look at. The first one is 1933, when Uranus was square Pluto, as it has been since 2012 through 2015. So during that period, you had the same sort of need for change, and then fighting against the change from certain powerful influences. And if you look back in the history of the 1930s, you've got the whole Nazi era beginning. You've got a depression in this country, and the need to change dramatically how money flows in this country and how finances are. And so you can see how that revolution took years and years to take place, but what resulted from it were so many of the things that we know today. So many of the programs, such as Social Security and Medicaid, came out of that period, as did the income tax came out of that period. Now, some people may think that was a bad thing, but it was a way, initially, as it began, it was a way of making sure that the very wealthiest people paid their fair share back into society. That was a big concern, because that's what had tipped off the Depression. So the next Uranus-Pluto connection is in 1942, and in this one, this is a nice one. This is when Uranus is sextile to Pluto. That means they're conjunct, or they're working together in partnership. So if you think about that, you have the end of World War II, where the totalitarian mindset of the Nazis and Japan and Italy was finally defeated, and decisively defeated. And so that change began to happen, in all of those countries, and in this one as well. There became a greater awareness of civil rights disparities. There became a greater awareness of of women being able to hold down jobs because they'd had to for most of the war while the men were away. So that ushered in some changes, and then 1965 is the next revolutionary era. And we know all about how, the 60s revolutions and changes and attitudes and mores and all of that. Uranus was conjunct with Pluto. That means they were working together again. And that, of course, facilitated all of those changes. Now, in 1978 and then in 1986, we have some rather mild influences where Uranus and Pluto are semi-sextile. Semi-sextile means they're kind of in conjunction, but a little bit, but not so much. And same with Uranus and Pluto. I'm sorry, same with 1986. Same kind of influence. So there's mild changes during that period of time. I guess in 1978 you can think about maybe the changes that were happening politically, as we began to move towards, I guess you could consider that to be a move towards the Reagan era. And then in 1986, you could see a change happening. Well, there were changes in how government was perceived. Government being perceived as a problem rather than a solution. And also, there was also the change in nuclear disarmament. I think that might be the best example of those two eras, 78 and 86. That was really the time when nuclear weapons were seen to be harmful, and something was done about it. 1996 has a sextile Uranus-Pluto situation. In 96, what more changes were happening? There were some changes happening in economics and finance. You had the end of Glass-Steagall Act, which had been in place since 1933, which was basically protecting people from banks that would use their money and gamble it away. And then also you had the beginning of the change that would eventually happen in the military. You had Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which was sort of the first step towards there being an acceptance of gays in the military. But that first step was basically, it's not your business, don't talk about it, and nobody else should ask you about it. And so that was sort of maybe the first step along that way. And then, of course, the seventh era is this era now, 2012 to 2015, that I've just been talking about. So there's that going on. The latest news to come from, I think, that kind of conflict is Greece. Greece's financial problems, and it's coming up against the Eurozone that wants the Greeks to accept certain lifestyle changes, that wants Greece to accept certain austerity measures that it does not feel anyone has the right to force them to do. So they are now again at another breaking point here, where the Greek banks will actually kind of phase out of the Eurozone if they cannot get more support, more funding from the European Central Bank. And the European Central Bank has been very adamant about not providing any additional aid to Greece, since the Greeks have stood up against being, forced to make certain changes that they don't believe are in their best interest. So it remains to be seen what happens. The banks, people are already sort of queuing up to the banks and taking their money out. And this could tip over into, them leaving the Eurozone, which could make the Eurozone a disaster area. So it remains to be seen what's going to happen. We're going to talk more about that next week. We'll have to, because we're running out of time, unfortunately. But let me briefly give you something to relieve your stress. The bridge pose in yoga. It's very simple. It's you start in lying on the floor. You can place a folded blanket if you want under your shoulders. Bend your knees. Place your feet flat on the floor, and with your feet no more than hip width apart, raise your spine up and lift your hips toward the ceiling as you exhale. You can keep the knees and thighs parallel. Engage the muscles of your lower back, buttocks, thighs, and abdomen to keep the body taut and firm. Lift the hips until the body is flat from chest to knees. And try to hold the pose for 30 seconds to a minute. Then when you release, you exhale and slowly roll your spine back down to the floor. And you can repeat as many times as you like. It's great for strengthening the legs, backs, relieving stress, and it's really a key component of most yoga routines. So there's the bridge pose for you. And we talked about Greece. We're going to talk more about that. So we've run really late on our show today, but time to say goodbye for the week, and hopefully we'll see you next week. Have a great one, and look for those turning points in your life.